Okay, for even and odd trig functions, here's what we're dealing with here for even and odd functions. So I have all six that we've got. We've got sine t, cosine t, tangent t, cotangent t, secant t, cosecant t. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put little cards around these, or put boxes around these. Call these little cards, right? So now I have three sets of these cards here. I got sine and cosecant. I've got cosine and secant, and I've got tangent and cotangent. All right. So it turns out that this set, cosecant and secant, are even functions. Okay, these are even functions. So that means that the other two functions have to be odd. All right. Sorry, my microphone got stuck there for a second. Okay, so anyways, we have even functions and we have odd functions. And so even functions are going to be cosine and secant, the ones in the middle. The odd functions are sine and cosecant, and tangent and cotangent, the ones on the end. Okay, so you're probably asking, what does it mean for even and odd? What does it even mean? Okay, so here's what it means for an even function. So that means that the cosine of negative t is the same thing as the cosine of t. So this says the cosine of a negative angle is the same thing as the cosine of that positive angle. And since cosine and secant are both even, we can say the same thing for secant. You can say the secant of negative t is the same thing as the positive secant of t. This is what it means for a function to be even. So then, what does it mean for a function to be odd? Well, that means that sine of negative t is equal to negative sine t. So the sine of a negative angle is the same thing as the negative of the sine of that same angle. So you can say the same thing about the cosecant of negative t. It's negative cosecant of t. And you can say the same thing about the tangent of negative t. It's equal to the negative tangent of t. And you can say the same thing about cotangent of negative t. It's the same thing as negative cotangent of t. This is what it means for a function to be odd. So we have these defined definitions here for odd and even. Okay, so one thing you might want to remember is that if you have an odd function, O stands for out. Odd, O, out. Learned that from Miss May. Thank you very much. All right, so how does this portray on the unit circle? So take, for example, let's say you have a point over here. We'll call that point x comma y, and we have an angle t. Okay. Well, if we take the angle negative t, which would be this direction here, we would get a point q. And what point would that have to be? If this is x comma y, then this would have to be x comma negative y. So notice that cosine the cosine for p and q for t and negative t are equal to each other, right? But the sine for t and negative t are opposite each other. That's what that means for cosine negative t is equal to cosine t, and sine of negative t equals negative sine t. It's the negative of that one. That's what it means on the unit circle. So how do we use this in some examples here? All right, so let's try to figure out the cosine of negative pi over 4. Well, okay, cosine is an even function, all right? So we know that the cosine of negative pi over 4 has to be the same thing as the positive cosine of pi over 4, and the positive cosine of pi over 4 is equal to root 2 over 2. That's just something we have to know. That's in quadrant 1 in the unit circle. All right, how about the tangent of negative pi over 4? Well, tangent is an odd function. Odd stands for out, so the negative sign can pop out in front. So we have negative tangent of pi over 4. Well, that's equal to the negative of pi over 4 is just, the tangent of pi over 4 is 1, so this is equal to negative 1. All right, the secant of negative pi over 4, okay? Secant, if we go back up here, check it out, secant is an even function, so therefore the secant of negative pi over 4 is equal to the positive secant of pi over 4, because that's what it means for it to be an even function. And secant is just 1 over the cosine. So this is equal to 1 over the cosine of a positive pi over 4. And we already know up here that the cosine of pi over 4 is root 2 over 2. So this is 1 over root 2 over 2. So I'm going to flip and multiply, which means I'm going to have 2 divided by root 2. And of course we clean this up by rationalizing the denominators. So I get 2 root 2 over 2. But of course the 2's cancel out, leaving me with a positive root 2. So the secant of negative pi over 4 is a positive root 2. All right, how about the sine of negative pi over 4? Sine, again, this is an odd function, right? Odd stands for O for out, means I'm going to have the sine of negative pi over 4 is the same thing as the negative sine of pi over 4, which is the negative of a root 2 over 2, which means I just have negative root 2 over 2. Even and odd functions.